I want you to understand this from the very start. Sometimes, the greatest heroes come from the most invisible places. This is a story about a woman no one expected to save a life. No one, except maybe the child who needed her most. Doctors said there was no time left, but she risked everything, the law, her freedom, her future, to save the billionaire's child. There is a heavy silence after that. Imagine the weight of a moment where hope seems lost forever. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're cleaning a kitchen, folding clothes, or heading home after a long day. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will surprise you. In the heart of San Francisco, where glass towers gleam under cold fog and the streets hum with restless ambition, lived Maria Gonzalez. Her hands were rough from scrubbing floors and washing dishes, her clothes simple, worn from endless cycles of hardship. She moved quietly through the cavernous rooms of the Whitmore estate, the mansion perched high above the city like a lonely fortress, where luxury was abundant, but human warmth was as scarce as sunlight in winter. The echo of her mop swept through the marble hallways like a quiet heartbeat amid the silence of a broken home. Each morning Maria would catch the 5:30 a.m. bus from her cramped studio apartment in the Mission District, watching the city wake up through rain-streaked windows. The fog rolled over Twin Peaks like a gray blanket, shrouding the mansions of Pacific Heights, where she worked but would never belong. Maria had not arrived at the Whitmore mansion by chance. 6 months earlier, she had left behind the vibrant murals and taco trucks of her neighborhood, a corner of San Francisco where neighbors nodded but didn't pry, where family meant everything and money meant survival. She bore a persistent sadness that lived in the corners of her eyes. Her father had been lost to illness the previous winter, his medical bills draining the family's meager savings despite their health insurance. Her mother now struggled to keep the family afloat, working double shifts at a downtown hotel while battling her own diabetes. Maria's yearning was simple: a steady job, respect, dignity. She never dreamed she'd enter the world of tech billionaires, a world where stock portfolios grew by millions while human connections withered like untended plants. The Whitmore fortune, built on cryptocurrency investments and real estate empire worth over $2 billion, could buy anything except what mattered most. The mansion itself was a monument to isolation. 37 rooms spread across 4 floors, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the Golden Gate Bridge, but felt more like barriers between the family and the world. Richard Whitmore had purchased the property for $48 million during the height of the tech boom, believing that success meant elevation, both literally and figuratively. The Whitmore family was a fortress of sorrow. Richard Whitmore, once a titan in Silicon Valley who'd made his initial fortune developing security software before pivoting to cryptocurrency mining, had everything money could buy: mansions, vintage car collections, art worth millions, but felt as hollow as the vast, cold rooms of his estate. His investment portfolio included Bitcoin holdings worth over $300 million, properties spanning from Malibu to Manhattan, and dividend-paying stocks that generated more passive income in a month than most families saw in a lifetime. But all his wealth couldn't buy back what he'd lost. His wife, Catherine, had left 3 years ago during a bitter divorce that dominated San Francisco's society pages. She'd taken their daughter Emma to New York, leaving Richard with their son Liam, who was now 10 years old and bedridden with a mysterious autoimmune condition that baffled every specialist money could hire. The doctors were clear. Despite access to the most expensive treatments, experimental therapies, and private medical facilities, Liam had very little time left. The diagnosis had been crushing: a rare genetic disorder that attacked his immune system, leaving him vulnerable to infections and constant fatigue. Richard had spent over $2 million on medical bills, flying specialists from Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, and even Switzerland to examine his son. Nothing worked. Each treatment seemed to drain more life from Liam's small frame. The house staff reflected the family's dysfunction. Mrs. Patricia Henley, the head housekeeper who'd worked for wealthy Pacific Heights families for 15 years, ruled the domestic empire with iron efficiency and barely concealed resentment. She commanded a salary of $90,000 annually, more than many San Francisco teachers, yet felt trapped in servitude to people she secretly despised. The nannies came and went like seasonal fog, unable to connect with a grieving father and a dying child. Hiring Maria was a decision born from desperation, not trust. She had appeared at the service entrance on a gray Tuesday morning, clutching a crumpled newspaper ad and letters of recommendation from families in her neighborhood. Her English carried the soft melody of her grandmother's Spanish lullabies, and her resume was humble: house cleaning, elderly care, occasional catering for church events. But something in her steady gaze and firm handshake made Richard's assistant offer her a trial period. Her daily commute became a ritual of hope and determination. Each morning at 5 a.m., Maria would dress carefully in her simple uniform, a navy blue dress she'd sewn herself, and walk 6 blocks to catch the 38 Geary bus. The ride took 45 minutes through the city's awakening neighborhoods, past Filipino bakeries in the Richmond, Irish pubs in the Sunset, and coffee shops where tech workers typed frantically on laptops worth more than her monthly rent. From her bus window, she'd watch San Francisco's social stratification unfold like a geographic map of inequality. The crowded apartments and narrow streets of her Mission District gave way to the wider avenues and pristine lawns of Pacific Heights, where homes sold for $20 million and parking spots cost more than most cars. But Maria felt no bitterness, only quiet determination to earn her place through honest work. The Whitmore estate sat behind imposing iron gates on Broadway Street, its limestone facade and manicured hedges announcing old money and older pain. The interior was a masterpiece of interior design that had been featured in Architectural Digest. Italian marble floors, crystal chandeliers from Austria, and original artwork that could fund a small school district. Yet the house felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Richard himself was a study in contrasts. At 42, his success story embodied the American dream twisted by grief. He'd grown up middle class in San Jose, the son of a mechanic and a school secretary, but his brilliance with computer systems had earned him a full scholarship to Stanford. By 25, he'd sold his first startup for $50 million. By 35, his cryptocurrency investments had made him one of the youngest billionaires in California. Forbes estimated his net worth at $3 billion. But he would have traded every penny to see his son run and play like other children. The morning Maria first knocked on the servants' entrance, Richard was sitting in his study, staring at medical bills that exceeded the GDP of small nations. The latest experimental treatment in Germany had cost $400,000 and yielded no improvement. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from investment managers, cryptocurrency exchanges, and real estate brokers, but each conversation felt meaningless against the backdrop of his son's suffering. Mrs. Henley answered the door with the weary expression of someone who'd hired and fired dozens of domestic workers. She studied Maria's simple appearance, the worn shoes, the careful posture, the hands that spoke of honest labor, and made immediate judgments. Another desperate immigrant, she thought, probably illegal, definitely temporary. The interview was brief and cold. Maria's references were adequate but unimpressive. Families from the Mission District who could barely afford domestic help, elderly clients who paid in cash and gratitude. Her English was clear but accented. Her experience limited to smaller homes and simpler needs. Mrs. Henley offered her the lowest position, assistant housekeeper, responsible for deep cleaning, laundry, and whatever tasks others considered beneath them. Maria accepted without negotiation. The salary was $800 per week. Decent money for her, but barely a rounding error in the Whitmore household budget. Richard spent more on wine each month than Maria would earn in a year, yet she approached the job with the same dedication she'd bring to caring for her own family. Her first week was a baptism by fire. The mansion's 37 rooms required constant maintenance, and each surface seemed designed to showcase dirt and imperfection. Maria learned the household's invisible hierarchies. Which rooms couldn't be cleaned when Richard had phone calls, which artwork couldn't be dusted without supervision, which areas of Liam's wing were off-limits during his medical treatments. She worked with methodical grace, her movements economical and purposeful. While other staff members rushed through tasks with barely concealed resentment, Maria cleaned as if each surface mattered. She noticed details others missed, the way morning light revealed dust motes dancing in the library, how the kitchen's copper pots tarnished despite rarely being used, the subtle scent of medicine that clung to fabrics throughout the house. Her fellow staff members watched Maria with suspicion and barely concealed contempt. To them, she represented everything they feared: replacement, redundancy, the reminder that wealth could always find cheaper labor. They whispered in corners about her immigration status, her modest wardrobe, her habit of staying late without requesting overtime pay. The cruelest was Mrs. Henley, who assigned Maria the most degrading tasks: cleaning toilets in unused guest bathrooms, scrubbing kitchen floors on her hands and knees, polishing silver that hadn't been used in years. Each assignment came with subtle insults disguised as instruction. "Make sure you understand how to clean properly," or "I hope you're more reliable than the last girl from your neighborhood." But Maria endured each humiliation with quiet dignity. She'd learned survival skills growing up in a housing project where respect was earned through perseverance, not words. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Mija, they can take your wages and your time, but they cannot touch your soul unless you let them." The real test came when she encountered Liam for the first time. The boy lay propped against white pillows in a room that looked more like a private hospital than a child's bedroom. Medical equipment hummed quietly in corners: oxygen monitors, IV stands, medication dispensers that delivered precise doses of expensive drugs around the clock. The treatments cost more per day than Maria's family spent in 6 months, yet Liam grew weaker with each passing week. He was small for 10 years old, his skin pale as morning fog, his dark eyes holding intelligence and sadness that seemed too mature for his years. Tubes carried nutrients to his bloodstream because eating had become difficult, and his medications cost $3,000 per month, just the portion not covered by their premium health insurance plan. When Maria entered his room to change bedsheets, Liam studied her with curious attention. Most staff members avoided eye contact, treating him like a fragile monument to tragedy. But Maria met his gaze with genuine warmth, offering a small smile before beginning her work. "What's your name?" Liam asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "Maria," she replied, continuing to fold hospital corners with practiced efficiency. "And you are Liam, yes? Your father told me you like stories." It was a small lie. Richard had mentioned nothing about his son's preferences, but Maria possessed an intuitive understanding of lonely children. In her neighborhood, she'd cared for dozens of kids while their parents worked multiple jobs, and she recognized the hunger for connection that lived behind Liam's polite silence. From that first conversation, something shifted in the oppressive atmosphere of the Whitmore mansion. Maria began spending extra minutes in Liam's room, not as assigned duty, but as natural kindness. She would hum softly while organizing his medications, her voice carrying melodies from her childhood in El Salvador, songs her own mother had sung during their hardest years. The other staff members noticed Maria's growing connection with Liam, and their resentment deepened. She was overstepping boundaries, they whispered, getting above her station, trying to manipulate the family for better treatment or higher wages. Mrs. Henley watched with particular malice, already planning ways to document Maria's unauthorized interactions. But Richard began noticing changes too. For the first time in months, Liam seemed to have moments of genuine contentment. His medical team noted improved sleep patterns and slightly better appetite, though they couldn't explain the subtle improvements. The boy who'd barely spoken for weeks began asking when Miss Maria would visit his room. Maria's presence brought unexpected warmth to spaces that had felt frozen in grief. She didn't clean around the family's pain. She acknowledged it with gentle humanity. When she found Richard sitting alone in the dining room, staring at family photos from happier times, she didn't retreat in embarrassment. Instead, she quietly served him coffee, prepared the way she'd learned he preferred, and continued her work with respectful silence. The investment reports and cryptocurrency portfolios that usually commanded Richard's attention began feeling hollow compared to these small moments of human connection. His wealth could fund entire hospitals, but it couldn't replicate the simple comfort Maria offered through her presence and care. As autumn fog rolled over San Francisco's hills, transforming the city into a dreamscape of gray and gold, Maria's influence on the Whitmore household continued growing like sunlight gradually warming a cold room. But with that growth came dangers she couldn't yet see: jealousy, fear, and the terrible power of those who felt threatened by her quiet strength. The storm was building, and Maria would soon discover that saving a life required risks far beyond anything she'd imagined. The law, her freedom, her future. Everything would be tested in ways that would force her to choose between safety and love, between survival and heroism. Meanwhile, Patricia Henley sharpened her knives in the shadows, planning an attack that would destroy Maria's reputation and remove her from the Whitmore household forever. But she had underestimated the power of quiet dignity and the fierce protection that grows between healing hearts. The real battle for Liam's life was about to begin, and Maria would face enemies more dangerous than any illness: the cruelty of those who profit from maintaining others' pain. Maria's second month at the Whitmore estate began with October's crisp arrival, when San Francisco's Indian summer gave way to the season's first real fog. The mansion's vast windows collected condensation like tears, and the heating system, worth more than most people's cars, hummed constantly to maintain perfect temperature in rooms where nobody truly lived. She had developed routines that brought small pockets of warmth to the sterile grandeur. Each morning at 6 a.m., after completing her commute from the Mission District, Maria would first check on Liam before beginning her assigned cleaning duties. She'd found him one dawn sitting by his bedroom window, watching seagulls wheel over the distant bay, his small frame dwarfed by the massive chair where nurses usually positioned him for breathing treatments. "They look free," Liam whispered, his voice barely audible above the oxygen concentrator's steady rhythm. Maria paused in arranging his morning medications, pills that cost more per bottle than her monthly rent. "Yes, mijo," she replied softly, using the Spanish endearment without thinking. But even birds must return home each night. It was a simple observation, but Liam turned from the window to study her face with new curiosity. In his limited world of medical procedures and worried adult conversations, Maria's words carried a different weight. Not the desperate optimism of doctors or the careful neutrality of nurses, but something that acknowledged both freedom and belonging. The household staff had noticed Maria's growing connection with the boy, and their whispered resentments grew sharper. During staff meetings in Mrs. Henley's office, a space decorated with certificates from hospitality management schools and photographs of previous wealthy employers, Maria became the invisible subject of increasing scrutiny. "She's spending too much time in the boys' room," muttered Jennifer, the day nurse whose salary of $75,000 annually still left her bitter about serving people whose stock portfolios gained more in an hour than she earned in months. "It's not professional." Mrs. Henley documented each observation in a leather-bound notebook, building a case that would justify Maria's dismissal when the moment was right. She'd perfected this strategy over 15 years of managing household staff for San Francisco's elite. Isolate the threats, gather evidence, eliminate problems before they threatened her position. Her own job security depended on maintaining strict hierarchies and preventing any domestic worker from gaining too much influence with the family. But Maria remained unaware of these machinations, focused instead on her work and the gradual changes she witnessed in Liam's condition. During her third week, she noticed him attempting to eat small portions of soup she'd prepared. Nothing fancy, just chicken broth with rice and vegetables, cooked with herbs her grandmother had taught her to use for sick children. The boy's appetite had been non-existent for months. Yet something about Maria's simple cooking seemed to awaken his interest in food. Richard observed these developments with cautious hope and growing confusion. His son's medical team, assembled from the most prestigious hospitals money could access, had tried every nutritional supplement and appetite stimulant available. They'd consulted with specialists from Stanford Medical, UCSF, and even flew in experts from Switzerland and Germany. The annual cost of Liam's medical care exceeded $800,000, not counting experimental treatments and private consultations. Yet here was his housekeeper, a woman with no medical training and minimal formal education, achieving results that had eluded teams of highly paid professionals. Richard found himself watching Maria work, trying to understand what made her presence different from the parade of nurses, therapists, and specialists who'd cycled through their home. Maria moved through the mansion with quiet purpose, but her real focus remained on small acts of care that seemed to reach Liam in ways clinical interventions couldn't. She began bringing flowers from the neglected garden, simple chrysanthemums and late-blooming roses that she'd arrange in small vases near his window. The sight of something alive and growing seemed to give him pleasure that expensive medical equipment couldn't replicate. During afternoon cleaning, Maria would hum softly, not conscious performance, but the natural soundtrack of someone comfortable with herself. The melodies were from her childhood in El Salvador, songs her mother had sung while washing clothes by hand and dreaming of better futures for her children. Liam began asking about the songs, and Maria would translate lyrics that spoke of hope, perseverance, and the quiet strength found in humble work. "My grandmother used to say that music is medicine for the soul," Maria explained one afternoon while dusting the expensive medical monitors that surrounded Liam's bed. "When the body hurts, sometimes the heart needs healing first." These conversations worried Mrs. Henley, who felt Maria was overstepping crucial boundaries. Domestic workers weren't supposed to develop philosophical relationships with their employers' children. They were meant to clean, organize, and remain invisible, not offer alternative perspectives on healing that might undermine expensive medical treatments. The tension reached a breaking point during a staff meeting in late October. Mrs. Henley had gathered evidence of what she termed inappropriate behavior. Maria's extended time in Liam's room, her conversations about non-medical topics, her preparation of unauthorized food that hadn't been approved by the boy's nutritionist. The accusations were packaged as concerns for professional standards and the child's well-being. "Mr. Whitmore pays for medical expertise, not folk remedies," Mrs. Henley declared to the assembled staff. "We can't have untrained personnel making decisions about the boy's care." But Richard himself had begun questioning the rigid protocols that governed his son's treatment. Despite access to every medical advantage money could buy, Liam continued declining. The latest consultation with specialists from Johns Hopkins had cost $45,000 and yielded only adjusted medication dosages that seemed to increase his fatigue rather than improve his condition. Meanwhile, during the hours when Maria was present, Liam showed signs of engagement that hadn't existed in months. He asked questions about her family, listened to stories about her neighborhood in the Mission District, and even attempted small jokes that revealed glimpses of the bright child he'd been before illness consumed his world. Richard found himself caught between expensive expertise and inexplicable results. His investment in traditional medical care represented not just financial commitment, but emotional hope, the belief that wealth could purchase salvation for his son. Yet Maria's simple presence seemed to accomplish what millions of dollars in treatment couldn't achieve. The conflict crystallized during a November afternoon when Maria discovered Liam attempting to draw with colored pencils, the first creative activity he'd shown interest in for over a year. His sketch was simple but touching. A small house with flowers in the garden and figures that looked like a family. When Maria praised his work, Liam smiled with genuine pleasure. Mrs. Henley witnessed this interaction and immediately reported it as evidence of Maria encouraging inappropriate attachments and interfering with medical protocols. She suggested that Maria's influence might be preventing Liam from accepting necessary treatments by offering false hope about recovery through non-medical means. The accusation reached Richard during a particularly stressful period. His cryptocurrency investments had lost $30 million during a market downturn, and his ex-wife Catherine had been calling repeatedly from New York, demanding updates about Liam's condition while threatening to seek custody if she felt the boy's care was inadequate. The pressure was crushing, and Mrs. Henley's concerns about Maria's unprofessional conduct seemed to offer a simple solution to one problem in his increasingly chaotic world. That evening, Richard confronted Maria in the mansion's industrial kitchen, a space designed for catering large events that never happened anymore. The room's stainless steel surfaces and commercial appliances reflected the house's emphasis on impressive functionality over human warmth. "Mrs. Henley says you've been spending excessive time with Liam," Richard began, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone drowning in impossible decisions. "She's concerned that your interactions might be confusing him about his medical treatment." Maria set down the dish towel she'd been folding and met Richard's gaze with calm directness. "Mr. Whitmore, I care for your son the same way I would care for any child who needs comfort. He is lonely, and loneliness can make any illness worse." Her simplicity caught Richard off guard. He'd expected defensiveness or excuses, but Maria offered only honest explanation. Yet Mrs. Henley's warnings echoed in his mind about liability, professional boundaries, and the risks of allowing untrained personnel too much influence over his son's care. "I think it would be better if you focused on your assigned cleaning duties," Richard said reluctantly. "Liam has medical professionals to handle his care needs." The hurt that flickered across Maria's face was quickly replaced by dignified acceptance. She nodded once and returned to her work, but something had shifted in the household's fragile balance. That night, Liam asked repeatedly when Maria would visit his room, and his disappointment at her absence seemed to drain the small improvements he'd shown in recent weeks. Mrs. Henley observed these developments with satisfaction, confident that she'd successfully eliminated a threat to her authority. But she failed to notice how the mansion's atmosphere began changing in Maria's absence, how silence returned to corners that had briefly warmed with human connection, how Liam's appetite disappeared again, how even Richard seemed to move through his home with renewed emptiness. The real tragedy was beginning to unfold, not in Liam's medical chart, but in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, where hope had briefly flickered before being snuffed out by fear and misunderstanding. Maria continued her work with professional detachment, but her heart ached for the small boy who'd begun trusting in possibilities his expensive medical team couldn't provide. Winter was coming to San Francisco, and with it, decisions that would test everyone's understanding of what it truly meant to heal. November brought San Francisco's wettest storms in decades, and the Whitmore mansion felt like a ship adrift in gray seas. Rain lashed against windows that offered panoramic views of nothing but fog, and the heating system struggled against dampness that seemed to seep through stone and steel alike. Inside, the atmosphere had grown heavier since Richard's conversation with Maria, though he couldn't quite identify why the house felt more oppressive than before. Liam's condition had visibly deteriorated in the 3 weeks since Maria's interactions with him were restricted. His appetite vanished completely, and the small improvements in energy and mood that had encouraged his medical team evaporated like morning mist. Dr. Patricia Coleman, his primary physician from UCSF Medical Center, noted the regression during her weekly visit, but attributed it to the natural progression of his autoimmune disorder. These conditions often have periods of apparent improvement followed by decline, she explained to Richard in the mansion's library, surrounded by first-edition books that remained unread and art worth millions that provided no comfort. "We shouldn't read too much into temporary fluctuations." But Richard had lived with his son's illness long enough to recognize patterns, and something about this particular decline felt different, more like retreat than progression. Liam asked fewer questions, showed no interest in activities that had briefly engaged him, and spent hours staring out his bedroom window with an expression that reminded Richard painfully of his own reflection during the darkest months after Catherine left. Maria continued her cleaning duties with professional efficiency, but the warmth that had begun transforming the household's atmosphere had disappeared. She moved through rooms like a ghost of her former presence, completing tasks without the gentle humming or small personal touches that had made sterile spaces feel temporarily alive. When she encountered Liam during necessary room cleaning, their interactions remained politely distant. She would ask about his comfort or needs, he would respond with monosyllabic politeness, and both seemed diminished by the imposed barriers between them. Mrs. Henley watched these developments with grim satisfaction, confident that she'd successfully eliminated a disruptive influence and restored proper household order. She documented Maria's improved professional boundaries in her leather-bound notebook, building evidence that her intervention had been necessary and effective. The other staff members, relieved that attention had shifted away from their own performances, settled back into routines of efficient indifference. But late at night, when the mansion's automated systems dimmed lights and activated security protocols, Richard found himself walking empty hallways and wondering what had changed. His investment portfolios continued generating passive income that exceeded most people's annual salaries. His cryptocurrency holdings alone had recovered their losses and added another $40 million during December's market rally. Yet financial success felt increasingly meaningless against the backdrop of his son's deteriorating condition. The breaking point came during the second week of December, when Liam's pediatric team recommended transitioning to palliative care. Dr. Coleman delivered the news in clinical language designed to soften devastating reality, but her message was clear. Active treatment had exhausted its possibilities, and the focus should shift to comfort rather than cure. "We've tried every available intervention," she explained during a consultation that cost $3,000 for 2 hours of Richard's time. The experimental treatments in Germany and Switzerland showed no significant improvement, and continuing aggressive therapy may actually diminish his quality of life during the time he has remaining. The words hit Richard like physical blows. Despite spending over $3 million on medical care, despite consulting with the world's leading specialists, despite leveraging every advantage his wealth could provide, he faced the same outcome that haunted poorer families who couldn't afford world-class treatment. Money, it seemed, couldn't purchase the only thing that truly mattered. That night, Richard sat in his study among investment reports and business documents that suddenly seemed absurd in their detailed irrelevance. His companies were thriving. His latest cryptocurrency venture had been valued at $200 million, and his real estate holdings continued appreciating in San Francisco's relentless market. He could afford anything except what he desperately needed: more time with his son. Unable to sleep, Richard walked to Liam's room and found the boy sitting by his window despite the late hour. The sight of his small figure silhouetted against glass streaked with rain created an image of heartbreaking fragility. "Can't sleep either?" Richard asked softly. Liam turned with a smile that seemed too mature for his 10 years. "I was thinking about Miss Maria's songs," he whispered. "She used to sing when she thought nobody was listening. They made me feel less alone." The simple statement pierced Richard's carefully maintained emotional barriers. Here was his dying son, surrounded by every comfort money could provide, missing the presence of a housekeeper who'd been banished for caring too much. "Would you like me to ask her to visit you?" Richard offered, though the words felt inadequate against the weight of what he'd denied his son. Liam's eyes brightened with hope so pure it was painful to witness. "Could you? I know she's busy with her work, but I miss talking to someone who doesn't look scared when she sees me." The observation was devastating in its accuracy. Richard realized that everyone in Liam's world, doctors, nurses, therapists, even Richard himself, approached the boy with expressions colored by medical knowledge and grim prognoses. Only Maria had looked at Liam and seen a child who needed companionship rather than a patient requiring management. The next morning, Richard found Maria in the mansion's laundry room, a space in the basement where industrial machines processed the household's endless supply of linens and clothing. She was folding towels with the same careful attention she brought to every task, each item perfectly aligned and organized. The sight of her working alone in the basement while his son lay upstairs longing for her presence crystallized Richard's understanding of how completely he'd misunderstood the situation. "Maria," he began, then paused, unsure how to bridge the distance he'd created through his fears and Mrs. Henley's manipulations. "I think I made a mistake." She looked up from her work with those steady eyes that had first impressed him months ago, clear, direct, and free of the resentment he probably deserved. "Mistake, Senor? About limiting your time with Liam," Mrs. Henley said. "She was concerned about professional boundaries, but I think I prioritized the wrong things." Maria continued folding towels while considering her response. "Your son is very sick, Mr. Whitmore, but he is still a little boy who needs to feel cared for, not just treated. Sometimes the heart needs healing before the body can follow." Her words echoed the conversation he'd overheard weeks earlier, when Maria had spoken to Liam about music being medicine for the soul. At the time, Richard had dismissed such statements as folk wisdom with no place in serious medical treatment. Now, facing the failure of expensive expertise, he wondered if wisdom might exist in forms his wealth couldn't purchase. "The doctors say there's nothing more they can do medically," Richard admitted, the words scraping his throat like broken glass. "They're recommending we focus on keeping him comfortable." Maria's hands stilled on the towels, and her expression softened with genuine sorrow. "I am very sorry, Señor. This must be breaking your heart." The simple acknowledgement of his pain, offered without platitudes or false hope, nearly undid Richard's careful composure. When had anyone last spoken to him about the emotional weight he carried, rather than updating him on medical procedures or investment opportunities? "He misses you," Richard continued. "He told me last night that your songs made him feel less alone." A tear slipped down Maria's cheek, quickly wiped away with the back of her hand. "I miss him too. He is a very special boy." "Izu, would you be willing to spend time with him again? Not as medical care, just as friendship. I realize now that he needs that kind of connection." Maria's smile transformed her entire face, revealing the warmth that had briefly brightened their household before fear and protocol had extinguished it. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore, it would be an honor." But their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Henley's appearance in the laundry room doorway, her expression sharp with suspicion and territorial alarm. She'd been monitoring the household's dynamics carefully, and Richard's private conversation with Maria in the staff work areas represented exactly the kind of boundary violation she'd been working to prevent. "Mr. Whitmore," she said with forced politeness, "I hope there isn't a problem with Maria's work performance." Richard studied Mrs. Henley's face and suddenly saw clearly what had been hidden behind her professional concern. Not protection of his family's interests, but preservation of her own authority and control. She'd manipulated his fears about Liam's care to eliminate perceived competition for influence within the household. "Actually, Patricia," Richard replied, using her first name with deliberate informality that signaled a shift in their dynamic, "I've been reconsidering our household policies. I think Liam would benefit from more personal attention from staff members who show genuine care for his well-being." Mrs. Henley's face tightened with understanding and alarm. "I'm not sure that's advisable from a liability perspective. Untrained personnel providing comfort care could create legal exposure if something goes wrong." "I appreciate your concern," Richard said evenly, "but I'm willing to accept that responsibility. My son's happiness during his remaining time is more important than protecting against theoretical risks." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Mrs. Henley recognized that her carefully constructed authority was crumbling. She'd overplayed her hand by underestimating Richard's growing desperation and his son's influence on him. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore," she replied with barely concealed anger. "I'll adjust the staff schedules accordingly." As Mrs. Henley left the laundry room, Richard realized he'd crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. He'd chosen his dying son's emotional needs over his head, housekeeper's professional protocols, and the decision would reshape everything about how their household functioned. Maria returned to Liam's room that afternoon, and the boy's joy at seeing her was so genuine and complete that Richard wondered how he'd ever been convinced to separate them. Within hours, small changes began appearing. Liam asked for soup Maria had prepared, showed interest in drawing materials, and began talking about topics beyond his medical condition. But Mrs. Henley was already planning her response to this challenge to her authority, and her plans would soon test everyone's understanding of loyalty, sacrifice, and the true cost of healing a broken family. December in San Francisco brought unseasonably warm weather that locals called earthquake weather. Still, dry air that made the city feel suspended between seasons. The Whitmore Mansion's automated climate control systems worked overtime to maintain perfect temperature and humidity. but no amount of technology could replicate the natural warmth that had returned to the household since Maria resumed her friendship with Liam. The boy's transformation was immediate and remarkable. Within a week of their reunion, Liam showed improvements that astonished his medical team. His appetite returned gradually, first for Maria's simple soups and rice dishes, then for foods he'd rejected for months. He began sitting up for longer periods, engaged in conversations about topics beyond his illness, and even attempted short walks around his room with Maria's gentle encouragement. Dr. Coleman documented these improvements with scientific caution, noting increased energy levels and better sleep patterns while avoiding speculation about their cause. Sometimes patients experience periods of stabilization, she explained to Richard during their weekly consultation. We shouldn't assume this represents permanent improvement, but it's certainly encouraging, Mom. Richard didn't care about medical explanations. His son was laughing again, actually laughing at stories Maria told about her neighborhood, about the characters who frequented the corner market where she bought groceries, about the elaborate quinceañera celebrations that filled Mission District streets with music and joy. Liam hung on every detail of Maria's descriptions, as if her words opened windows to a world more vivid and alive than anything his wealth had provided. Tell me about the man with the singing dog, Liam requested one afternoon, referring to a street performer Maria had mentioned. Ah, Señor Miguel. Maria smiled, settling into the comfortable chair beside Liam's bed. Every morning he stands at the BART station with his little terrier, Rico. When Miguel plays guitar, Rico howls along like he thinks he's Pavarotti. People drop money in the guitar case just to hear them perform together. Does Rico really think he can sing? Liam giggled, the sound so foreign to the mansion's usual silence that it drew Richard from his study to listen outside the bedroom door. I think Rico knows exactly what he's doing, Maria replied with a mock seriousness. He's learned that making people smile is valuable work. Even if your voice isn't perfect, bringing joy to others is its own kind of success. The simple story contained layers of meaning that weren't lost on Richard. Maria's tales weren't just entertainment, they were gentle lessons about finding purpose through serving others, about dignity existing in humble circumstances, about community and connection transcending material wealth. Her stories presented a world where happiness came from relationships rather than possessions, where success was measured in smiles rather than stock portfolios. But Mrs. Henley watched these developments with growing alarm and resentment. Maria's rising influence with both Richard and Liam threatened everything she'd built during 15 years of managing wealthy households. Her authority had always depended on maintaining clear hierarchies. Employers gave orders, staff members followed them, and head housekeepers controlled information and access between the two groups. Maria's relationship with the family bypassed these traditional structures entirely. She communicated directly with Richard about Liam's needs, made independent decisions about meals and activities, and received gratitude and respect that Mrs. Henley felt should flow through proper channels. The situation violated every professional protocol she'd established to protect her position. During staff meetings, Mrs. Henley began documenting what she characterized as Maria's inappropriate presumptions and boundary violations. She noted instances when Maria had prepared food without consulting the approved meal plans, when she'd rearranged furniture in Liam's room to improve his comfort, when she'd suggested modifications to his daily routine that differed from medical recommendations. She's acting like she's part of the family instead of an employee, Mrs. Henley complained to Jennifer, the day nurse. It's unprofessional and potentially dangerous. What if she gives advice that conflicts with his medical treatment? Jennifer, whose own relationship with Liam had never progressed beyond clinical efficiency, felt threatened by the boy's obvious preference for Maria's company. You're right to be concerned. She doesn't have medical training, but she's making decisions about his care as if she does. The conspiracy grew as other staff members joined their criticism. Maria's ability to connect with Liam highlighted their own limitations and made their carefully maintained professional distance seem cold and inadequate. Rather than examining their own approaches, they chose to frame Maria's success as dangerous overreach that required correction. Mrs. Henley began preparing her most serious challenge to Maria's position, an accusation that would be impossible to ignore or forgive. She waited for the perfect opportunity, knowing that timing would be crucial for maximum impact. The opportunity came during the third week of December when Richard traveled to Los Angeles for urgent business meetings related to his cryptocurrency investments. A major exchange where he held $40 million in Bitcoin had been hacked, and his physical presence was required to verify his identity and protect his assets. The crisis would keep him away for at least 3 days, leaving the household under Mrs. Henley's direct supervision. On Richard's second day away, Liam developed what appeared to be a minor respiratory infection, nothing serious by the standards of his ongoing condition, but concerning enough to require careful monitoring. His breathing became slightly labored, and he developed a low-grade fever that made him lethargic and uncomfortable. Dr. Coleman prescribed antibiotics and increased his oxygen flow, recommending bed rest and careful observation. The medications cost $800 for a 3-day supply, but Richard authorized the expense immediately via phone from Los Angeles. Everything about Liam's treatment followed established medical protocols, and his condition remained stable throughout the day. But by evening, Liam's spirits had plummeted along with his physical energy. The return of illness symptoms reminded him powerfully of his mortality and triggered the profound sadness that had characterized his condition before Maria's companionship brightened his days. He refused dinner, barely spoke to his nurses, and lay staring at the ceiling with tears slipping silently down his cheeks. Maria found him in this state when she arrived for her evening shift, and her heart broke at the sight of defeat in his young face. She sat beside his bed and took his small hand in hers, offering silent comfort while he cried. "I thought I was getting better," Liam whispered, "but I'm still sick. I'm still going to die, aren't I?" The question pierced Maria's heart with recognition. She'd asked similar questions as a child, watching her own father waste away from illness their family couldn't afford to treat properly. She knew the particular despair that came from hoping for improvement only to face evidence of mortality's persistence. "Yes, mijo," Maria said softly, using the endearment that had become natural between them. "Your body is very sick, but that doesn't mean you stop being important, or that people stop loving you." "But what if I die before Papa gets home? What if he remembers me being sad and scared instead of happy?" The fear in Liam's voice revealed his deepest anxiety. Not about death itself, but about disappointing his father and being remembered as a source of sorrow rather than joy. Maria understood instinctively that this moment required more than words or comfort. It demanded action that might risk everything she'd built. "Listen to me," Maria said firmly, making a decision that would change both their lives. "Tomorrow morning, if you're feeling strong enough, I'm going to take you outside, just for a little while, to see the sun and breathe fresh air." Liam's eyes widened with hope and fear. "But I'm not allowed outside. The doctor said I might catch infections." "Sometimes," Maria replied, "the soul needs healing more than the body needs protection. If you want to go outside, we'll find a way to make it safe." It was a promise that violated every medical protocol and household rule, a decision that could cost Maria her job and potentially expose her to legal liability if anything went wrong. But looking at Liam's tear-stained face, she knew that some risks were worth taking for love. Mrs. Henley, monitoring the household through her network of loyal staff members, learned about Maria's promise within hours. She recognized immediately that she'd been handed the perfect weapon to destroy Maria's position permanently, evidence of reckless endangerment that even Richard's growing fondness for the housekeeper couldn't excuse or forgive. The trap was set, and Maria had no idea that her act of compassion would soon be twisted into grounds for her destruction. The next morning dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that made San Francisco's winter days feel like gifts from heaven. Fog had lifted early, revealing views of the Golden Gate Bridge stretched like a vermilion ribbon across sapphire water, and the December air carried unusual warmth that promised a perfect day for anyone healthy enough to enjoy it. Maria arrived at the Whitmore mansion with her heart racing and her mind clear about the risk she was taking. She'd lain awake most of the night considering Liam's desperate need for hope against the potential consequences of violating his medical restrictions. By morning, love had won the argument with prudence. She found Liam sitting up in bed, more alert and energetic than he'd been since developing his respiratory infection 2 days earlier. The antibiotics were working, his fever had broken during the night, and his breathing had improved significantly. Most importantly, his eyes held anticipation instead of despair. "Are we really going outside?" he whispered, glancing toward his bedroom door as if expecting adults to appear and forbid the adventure. "If you're feeling strong enough," Maria replied, assessing his condition with the intuitive understanding she'd developed about his physical patterns. "We'll go slowly, stay close to the house, and come back inside if you get tired." She'd planned carefully during her sleepless night. The mansion's garden faced east, where morning sun would provide warmth without the harsh glare that might strain Liam's sensitive eyes. A covered patio offered shelter if he needed rest, and she'd prepared a thermos of chamomile tea with honey, a remedy her grandmother had used for respiratory ailments. Mrs. Henley had deliberately scheduled herself for morning errands, creating the opportunity for Maria's plan while positioning herself with perfect alibi when the consequences unfolded. She'd left detailed instructions with Jennifer about monitoring Liam's condition, but made no mention of the unauthorized outdoor expedition she expected to occur. At 10 a.m., when the house felt empty except for distant sounds of regular staff activities, Maria helped Liam dress warmly in layers of soft clothing that would protect him from temperature changes. She carried a portable oxygen tank from his medical supplies, ensuring they could maintain his breathing support if needed. "This will be our secret adventure," Maria told him as they moved slowly through hallways toward the garden door. "Just you, me, and whatever magic we find outside." The mansion's garden had been professionally designed to require minimal maintenance, elegant hardscaping with drought-resistant plants that looked impressive without demanding daily care. But in neglecting the space, the family had also abandoned opportunities for the kind of natural beauty that money couldn't quite purchase. When Maria opened the French doors leading to the garden patio, Liam gasped with wonder at his first breath of unfiltered outdoor air in over 6 months. The sensation of natural breeze on his face, the complex scents of eucalyptus and roses, the sound of birds singing in nearby trees, all combined to awaken senses that had grown dormant in his climate-controlled bedroom. "It's so bright," he marveled, blinking in sunlight that seemed impossibly vibrant compared to the mansion's artificial illumination. "Your eyes will adjust," Maria assured him, settling him carefully in a cushioned patio chair where shade provided comfort while maintaining the joy of outdoor connection. "How does it feel?" "Like I'm alive again," Liam replied with simple honesty that made Maria's heart soar with validation for her risky decision. They sat together in companionable silence, sharing the thermos of tea while watching clouds drift across the city skyline. Liam pointed out landmarks he recognized from his bedroom window: Alcatraz Island, the distinctive towers of downtown San Francisco, planes approaching the distant airport. But experiencing these sights from ground level, surrounded by natural air and authentic light, transformed familiar views into discoveries. "Tell me about your first day in America," Liam requested, settling deeper into his chair with the contentment of someone finally comfortable in his own skin. Maria smiled, remembering her arrival in San Francisco 15 years earlier with 2 suitcases and hopes that seemed impossibly large. "I was so scared," she admitted. Everything was different: the language, the food, the way people moved so fast without talking to each other. But I was also excited because I knew I could build a better life if I worked hard enough. "Were you lonely?" Very lonely at first. I missed my family, missed the sounds and smells of home, but I learned that loneliness gets smaller when you focus on helping other people instead of feeling sorry for yourself. The simple philosophy resonated with Liam, who'd spent months trapped in self-pity about his illness. "Is that why you take care of me? Because helping makes loneliness smaller," I take care of you because you have a beautiful heart and you deserve to feel loved, Maria replied. But yes, loving you makes my own sadness lighter, too. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of car doors slamming in the mansion's circular driveway. Mrs. Henley had returned from her errands with perfect timing to discover Maria's violation of household rules and medical protocols. She'd brought Dr. Coleman with her, claiming concern about Liam's condition and need for immediate medical evaluation. The trap had been sprung with ruthless precision. Mrs. Henley and Dr. Coleman rounded the corner to find Liam sitting peacefully in the garden, his color better than it had been in days, his breathing obviously improved by the fresh air and emotional uplift. But instead of celebrating these improvements, Mrs. Henley immediately launched her attack. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice sharp with manufactured outrage. "Liam's medical restrictions explicitly forbid outdoor exposure due to infection risk." Dr. Coleman's professional concern was genuine, though her alarm was influenced by Mrs. Henley's dramatic presentation of the situation. "Liam shouldn't be outside without medical supervision," she said, immediately beginning to assess his vital signs. "His immune system is severely compromised." Maria stood calmly, holding Liam's hand as he looked between the adults with growing anxiety. She'd known this confrontation was inevitable and had prepared herself to accept responsibility for her decision. "He needed fresh air and sunlight," Maria explained simply. "His breathing has improved since we came outside, and his spirits are much better." "That's not your decision to make," Mrs. Henley snapped. "You're not a doctor, you're not his parent, and you have no authority to override medical instructions." The accusation contained enough truth to be devastating. Maria had indeed overstepped her official role, violated explicit medical protocols, and made independent decisions about Liam's care. That her judgment had been correct about his need for outdoor time didn't change the fact that she'd exceeded her authority as a domestic employee. Dr. Coleman completed her examination and found Liam's condition actually improved from their garden adventure. But she couldn't publicly endorse Maria's decision without undermining the medical protocols that governed his care. "He seems to be doing well," she admitted reluctantly, "but this can't happen again without proper medical clearance." "It won't happen again because Maria will no longer be employed in this household," Mrs. Henley declared with triumph, barely concealed behind professional concern. "Her judgment is clearly too poor to trust with responsibility for a critically ill child." Liam's face crumpled with understanding. His magical morning outside had cost Maria her job, and worse, it might deny him her companionship during his remaining time. "Please don't fire Miss Maria," he pleaded. "I asked her to take me outside. It was my idea." But Mrs. Henley had orchestrated the situation too carefully to allow sentiment to interfere with her victory. "Mr. Whitmore will be informed immediately about this serious breach of trust and medical safety. Maria will be terminated as soon as he returns from Los Angeles." As Liam was wheeled back inside and Maria began gathering the thermos and cushions from their interrupted adventure, both realized that moments of joy often came at prices too high to calculate. Their brief escape into sunshine and hope had triggered consequences that would test everyone's understanding of what truly mattered in the final accounting of love versus rules. Mrs. Henley's trap had worked perfectly, but she'd underestimated the power of truth and the fierce protection that grows between healing hearts. Richard's return from Los Angeles late that evening coincided with one of the worst Pacific storms to hit San Francisco in years. Wind howled around the mansion's reinforced windows, and rain struck the glass like handfuls of thrown pebbles. Inside, the house felt more divided than ever. Mrs. Henley waited in the library with her carefully prepared case against Maria, while upstairs, Liam lay in his bedroom refusing to speak to anyone except to ask repeatedly when Maria would return. The business crisis that had taken Richard to Los Angeles had resolved favorably. His cryptocurrency holdings were secure, and he'd actually negotiated a partnership deal worth $50 million while protecting his existing investments. But financial success felt hollow as he listened to Mrs. Henley's dramatic account of Maria's reckless endangerment of his son. She violated every medical protocol, Mrs. Henley insisted, her leather-bound notebook open to pages of documentation she'd prepared. Dr. Coleman confirmed that exposing Liam to outdoor pathogens could have triggered a life-threatening infection. Maria's judgment cannot be trusted with your son's safety. The accusations were presented with professional precision and genuine concern that made them difficult to dismiss. Richard found himself caught between his growing appreciation for Maria's positive influence and the undeniable fact that she'd exceeded her authority in potentially dangerous ways. "What was Liam's actual condition when you found them outside?" Richard asked, seeking details beyond Mrs. Henley's emotional interpretation. Dr. Coleman said he appeared stable, but that's not the point. The risk was enormous, and Maria made the decision without consulting anyone with medical training or legal authority. Mrs. Henley's argument contained enough truth to be compelling. Liam's health was so precarious that any deviation from established protocols represented genuine risk. If Maria's decision had triggered complications, Richard could face not only his son's death, but potential liability for allowing untrained personnel to make medical judgments. Yet something about Mrs. Henley's presentation felt wrong. Too prepared, too perfectly timed, too focused on Maria's punishment rather than Liam's well-being. Richard had survived 15 years in Silicon Valley's cutthroat business environment by recognizing when people's stated motivations differed from their actual agendas. "I need to talk to Liam before making any decisions," Richard said. Mrs. Henley's face tightened with annoyance. "With respect, Mr. Whitmore, a 10-year-old child isn't qualified to evaluate the appropriateness of medical decisions. His attachment to Maria might make him defend her actions regardless of their danger." But Richard was already heading upstairs, leaving Mrs. Henley in the library with her notebook and her carefully constructed case. He found Liam sitting by his bedroom window, watching rain streak the glass while tears slipped down his cheeks. "Papa?" Liam turned with hope that immediately dimmed when he saw Richard's serious expression. "Are you going to fire Miss Maria?" "I need to understand what happened this morning. Mrs. Henley says Maria took you outside against medical orders." "I asked her to take me outside," Liam replied with quiet dignity. "I told her I felt trapped and scared, and she said sometimes the soul needs healing more than the body needs protection." The words hit Richard with familiar weight. He'd heard Maria use similar language before, speaking about healing that existed beyond medical intervention. At the time, he'd dismissed such statements as folk wisdom with limited relevance to serious illness. Now, seeing his son's obvious distress about losing Maria's companionship, he wondered if he'd been wrong about what constituted genuine care. "How did you feel when you were outside?" Liam's face brightened despite his tears. "Alive, Papa. For the first time in months, I felt alive instead of just sick. The air smelled like flowers, and birds were singing, and I could see the whole city spread out like a picture book." "Were you scared about being away from your medical equipment?" "A little, but Miss Maria brought the oxygen tank and checked on me constantly. She was very careful, Papa. She just wanted me to remember what it felt like to be outside before." Liam's voice trailed off, but his meaning was clear. Before he died. The unspoken words hung between them, acknowledging the reality that expensive medical care couldn't change. Despite millions of dollars in treatment, Liam's time remained limited, and his remaining days should include joy rather than just medical management. "Mrs. Henley says what Maria did was dangerous," Richard said gently. "Maybe it was a little dangerous," Liam admitted with startling maturity. "But Papa, I've been safe in my room for 6 months and I'm still dying. At least this morning I got to feel like a regular boy instead of just a patient." The simple truth pierced Richard's heart with understanding he wished he could avoid. His son was dying despite every medical advantage money could provide. The choice wasn't between safe recovery and dangerous adventure. It was between sterile decline and meaningful connection during whatever time remained. That night, Richard sat in his study reviewing financial documents that no longer held his attention. His cryptocurrency portfolio had gained another $2 million during the day's trading. His real estate investments continued appreciating in San Francisco's relentless market. and his various business ventures generated passive income that exceeded most people's annual salaries. Yet none of this wealth could purchase what Liam truly needed: someone who saw him as a child rather than a patient, who offered hope rather than careful management of decline. Around midnight, Richard made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He called Maria's cell phone, knowing she might be asleep but unable to wait until morning for the conversation that would determine his son's final months. Maria answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the late hour. "Mr. Whitmore? Is Liam okay?" Her first concern was for his son's well-being, not her own job security. A response that told Richard everything he needed to know about her priorities and character. "Liam is fine physically, but he's heartbroken about potentially losing your friendship. I need to ask you something directly. Do you believe taking him outside was worth the risk?" Maria's silence stretched long enough that Richard wondered if the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd considered this question throughout a sleepless night. "Mr. Whitmore, your son is dying despite having access to the best medical care in the world. I cannot change that terrible truth, but I can help him feel loved and alive during the time he has left. This morning, for 1 hour, he was not a patient. He was a little boy enjoying sunshine and fresh air. If that was dangerous, then yes, it was worth the risk." Her honesty and clarity cut through the confusion that had plagued Richard since Mrs. Henley's accusations. Maria hadn't acted from carelessness or poor judgment. She'd made a conscious decision to prioritize Liam's emotional needs over medical protocols because she understood something about dying that expensive expertise had missed. "Mrs. Henley wants me to fire you immediately," Richard said. "I understand. I knew there would be consequences when I made that choice." "What if I don't fire you? What if I instead ask Mrs. Henley to find other employment?" The question surprised Maria into another long silence. When she responded, her voice carried hope tempered by realistic caution. "That would mean choosing between professional medical advice and the judgment of your housekeeper. Are you prepared for that kind of responsibility?" "Hayu, I'm prepared to choose between people who see my son as a medical case and someone who sees him as a child who deserves joy during his remaining time. The question is whether you're prepared to help me make that choice meaningful." Maria's answer came without hesitation. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore, it would be my honor." The decision felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating. Richard was choosing love over liability, hope over protocols, and trusting his dying son's happiness to a woman whose only qualifications were compassion and intuitive understanding of human need. By morning, Mrs. Henley would be gone, and Maria would begin her transformation from housekeeper to something approaching family, a role that would test everyone's understanding of what it meant to face mortality with dignity and grace. The storm outside continued raging, but inside the Whitmore mansion, something resembling peace was finally taking root. Christmas morning arrived in San Francisco wrapped in fog so thick it seemed to muffle sound itself, creating a hushed cocoon around the Whitmore mansion that felt appropriate for the profound changes that had transformed the household over the past week. Richard's decision to dismiss Mrs. Henley and elevate Maria's role had sent shockwaves through the domestic staff, but the results spoke louder than any professional protocols could dictate. Liam had experienced his best week in months. With Maria's official blessing to make decisions about his daily care, always in consultation with Dr. Coleman but no longer constrained by rigid institutional thinking, his world had expanded beyond the sterile boundaries of his bedroom. They'd established routines that balanced medical necessity with human need. Morning conversations over breakfast Maria prepared, according to his preferences, afternoon activities that might include gentle walks through the mansion's hallways or sitting by windows where natural light could reach his face, and evening stories that transported him beyond the limitations of illness. The transformation in Liam's condition was subtle, but undeniable. His appetite had stabilized, his sleep patterns improved, and most remarkably, his engagement with life had returned. He asked questions about Maria's family, requested specific songs she hummed while organizing his medications, and began expressing opinions about food, activities, and daily routines that suggested someone actively participating in life rather than passively enduring medical management. Dr. Coleman had initially resisted the changes, concerned about liability and the precedent of allowing non-medical personnel to influence patient care decisions. But Liam's measurable improvements, better vital signs, reduced anxiety, increased cooperation with necessary treatments, made her objections difficult to sustain. During her Christmas Eve visit, she'd noted in his chart that patient shows marked improvement in mood and energy levels following environmental and care routine modifications. The medical language was carefully neutral, but Richard understood the subtext. Maria's approach was working in ways that months of expensive expertise hadn't achieved. Christmas morning found Maria arriving earlier than usual, carrying wrapped presents she'd purchased with money carefully saved from her salary. For Liam, she'd chosen art supplies and a blank journal where he could record thoughts, draw pictures, or write letters to people he loved. For Richard, she'd selected a small potted plant, a hardy succulent that would thrive with minimal care while providing something alive and growing for his office. The gifts were modest by the standards of the Whitmore household, where Christmas typically involved expensive electronics, luxury items, and presents chosen by personal shoppers rather than purchased with personal thought. But Maria's gifts carried weight that money couldn't replicate. They were selected specifically for their recipients, chosen with understanding of their individual needs and personalities. Liam's joy at receiving the art supplies was pure and complete. He immediately began drawing, his subjects revealing the impact of recent experiences: flowers from the garden they'd visited, birds he'd observed through windows, and portraits of Maria that captured her gentle smile with surprising artistic skill. "This is the best Christmas present I've ever gotten," Liam declared, comparing his modest art kit to the expensive gaming systems and electronic devices that filled his room but had never truly engaged his interest. Richard watched his son's happiness with emotions that mixed joy and sorrow in equal measure. The sight of Liam actively creating rather than passively consuming entertainment represented a kind of victory, but it came against the backdrop of medical reality that hadn't changed. The boy was still dying, despite his improved spirits and temporary stability. But Maria had taught them both that accepting mortality didn't require abandoning hope or happiness. Death would come eventually, but life could be meaningful and beautiful until that moment arrived. The gift wasn't more time. It was better time, richer time, time filled with connection and purpose rather than just medical procedures and careful monitoring. The day after Christmas brought an unexpected visitor who would test everyone's understanding of family dynamics and emotional loyalties. Catherine Whitmore, Richard's ex-wife and Liam's mother, arrived unannounced from New York after receiving reports about her son's improving condition and the dramatic changes in household management. Catherine had been absent from Liam's daily care for 3 years, initially by choice during the bitter divorce proceedings, then by geographical necessity as she'd established new life in Manhattan. Her visits had become irregular and stressful, complicated by guilt about her absence and anger about decisions made without her input. But reports of Liam's improvement, and particularly the influence of a housekeeper who'd somehow succeeded where expensive medical teams had struggled, brought her back to San Francisco with questions and concerns. She arrived at the mansion accompanied by her attorney and a child psychologist she'd hired to evaluate Liam's care situation. Catherine had been successful in her own right before marriage, a marketing executive with an MBA from Wharton, and her approach to crisis situations involved professional expertise, documented evidence, and legal protection. The idea that her critically ill son's care had been entrusted to domestic help rather than medical specialists alarmed her deeply. "I want to understand exactly what's been happening here," Catherine announced to Richard in the mansion's library, her tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to corporate boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations. "The reports I'm receiving about Liam's care seem irregular." Richard had dreaded this confrontation since making the decision to prioritize Maria's approach over conventional medical management. Catherine's concerns weren't unreasonable. She was a mother worried about her dying child's treatment, arriving to find non-traditional methods being employed by someone without credentials or training she could evaluate. "Liam has shown remarkable improvement since we adjusted his care routine," Richard explained. "His spirits are better, his appetite has returned, and he's more engaged with life than he's been in months." "Under the supervision of a housekeeper rather than medical professionals," Catherine replied sharply. "Richard, I understand you're desperate to help him, but making emotional decisions about medical care could be dangerous." The argument contained echoes of Mrs. Henley's accusations, but coming from Liam's mother, the concerns carried different weight. Catherine had legal rights regarding her son's treatment, and her threatened intervention could disrupt everything that had been built over recent months. Their confrontation was interrupted by Liam himself, who'd heard his mother's voice and come downstairs with Maria's assistance. The sight of him walking under his own power, smiling with genuine pleasure at seeing Catherine, immediately complicated her prepared arguments about inadequate care. "Mama!" Liam embraced Catherine with energy that surprised her. In her memory, he'd been a frail, listless child overwhelmed by illness. The boy who hugged her seemed genuinely happy despite his obvious physical limitations. "You look wonderful, sweetheart," Catherine said, her voice catching with emotion she hadn't expected. "I've missed you so much." "I missed you too. Do you want to meet Miss Maria? She's been taking such good care of me, and she tells the best stories about her neighborhood." The simple request placed Catherine in an impossible position. She'd arrived prepared to challenge Maria's influence as unprofessional and potentially harmful, but her son's obvious affection and improved condition made such accusations difficult to sustain. Maria appeared in the library doorway with the quiet dignity that had characterized her presence throughout the household's various crises. She wore her simple work dress and carried herself with calm confidence, showing no intimidation at meeting Liam's mother or the attorney who accompanied her. "Mrs. Whitmore," Maria said politely, "Liam has missed you very much. He talks about you often." Catherine studied Maria with the analytical skills she'd developed during years in corporate environments, looking for signs of manipulation, overreach, or inappropriate attachment. Instead, she saw someone who seemed genuinely pleased about Liam's reunion with his mother, showing no territorial behavior or defensive posturing. "I understand you've been helping with Liam's care," Catherine said carefully. "I try to make sure he feels comfortable and loved," Maria replied simply. "He is a very special boy who deserves all the happiness we can give him." The response was so free of professional jargon or defensive justification that Catherine found herself momentarily disarmed. She'd expected to encounter someone making medical claims or seeking credit for Liam's improvements. Instead, Maria spoke about her role in terms of love and comfort, goals that were hard to argue against, even if her methods seemed unorthodox. The real test came during the following days as Catherine observed the household dynamics and her son's daily routines. She watched Maria prepare meals tailored to Liam's preferences and nutritional needs, facilitate conversations that engaged his intelligence and curiosity, and provide emotional support that seemed to strengthen his resilience against illness. Most importantly, Catherine saw her son laughing, creating art, expressing opinions, and participating in life with enthusiasm that hadn't existed during her previous visits. Whatever Maria was doing, whether it aligned with professional medical protocols or not, was clearly working in ways that mattered most. The confrontation everyone expected never materialized. Instead, Catherine found herself gradually accepting that her son's needs might be served better by someone who offered love and companionship, rather than just clinical expertise. The decision wasn't easy. It required abandoning preconceptions about proper medical care and trusting outcomes over credentials. By New Year's Eve, Catherine had decided to support Richard's unorthodox care decisions while establishing her own role in Liam's remaining time. She would stay in San Francisco indefinitely, working remotely from New York while participating in her son's daily life and the transformed family dynamic that Maria had helped create. The year ended not with resolution, Liam's medical condition remained unchanged, but with something more valuable: a family reunited around love rather than divided by fear, and a recognition that healing could take many forms, not all of them measurable by medical standards. Maria had achieved something that millions of dollars and world-class expertise couldn't accomplish. She'd brought a broken family back together around hope rather than despair, love rather than loss, and the understanding that dignity in dying required first learning to truly live. Winter deepened into January with unusual intensity for San Francisco, bringing days when fog never lifted and rain fell in steady sheets that transformed the city into an impressionist painting of gray and silver. Inside the Whitmore mansion, however, warmth had taken root in ways that seemed to generate their own interior climate, independent of weather or season. The presence of both parents had created unexpected stability in Liam's world. Catherine had rented a furnished apartment in Pacific Heights, close enough for daily visits, but maintaining independence that allowed her to process her own complicated emotions about their son's condition. Her relationship with Richard remained cordial but distant, focused entirely on Liam's well-being rather than attempting to resolve their previous conflicts. More surprisingly, Catherine had developed genuine appreciation for Maria's approach to Liam's care. Initially skeptical of methods that seemed to prioritize emotional comfort over medical precision, she'd gradually recognized that Maria's instincts about her son were consistently accurate and beneficial. When Liam expressed preferences about food, activities, or daily routines, Maria listened with attention that validated his autonomy even within the constraints of serious illness. "She treats him like a person rather than a patient," Catherine observed to Richard during one of their careful conversations about household management. "The medical team focuses on managing his condition, but Maria focuses on nurturing his spirit. Both approaches seem necessary." Dr. Coleman had also adjusted her perspective, though professional caution prevented her from publicly endorsing non-medical interventions. Privately, she acknowledged that Liam's improvements correlated clearly with environmental changes rather than medication adjustments. His vital signs remained stable, his appetite continued improving, and most remarkably, his emotional resilience had strengthened to the point where he discussed his illness with acceptance rather than despair. "Some patients respond well to holistic care approaches," Dr. Coleman noted in her reports, using language that allowed her to document Maria's influence without abandoning medical protocols. "Patient shows continued improvement in quality of life measures. The transformation was evident in daily interactions. Liam had begun expressing interest in activities beyond his immediate medical needs. He asked about current events, requested books about subjects that fascinated him, and even began planning projects he wanted to complete. His most ambitious goal was creating a detailed drawing of San Francisco, as seen from his bedroom window, a panoramic artwork that would capture the city's landmarks with the precision of someone who'd spent months observing every detail. "I want to leave something beautiful behind," Liam explained to Maria while working on preliminary sketches. "Something that shows I really saw the world, not just my illness." The statement revealed maturity that came from facing mortality with support rather than isolation. Maria had helped him understand that acknowledging death didn't require abandoning purpose or creativity. It could actually intensify the meaning found in daily choices and expressions. But January also brought a medical crisis that would test everyone's faith in the wisdom of their unorthodox care decisions. During the third week of the month, Liam developed pneumonia, a development his compromised immune system made both predictable and potentially catastrophic. His temperature spiked to dangerous levels, his breathing became labored even with oxygen support, and his condition deteriorated rapidly enough to require hospitalization. The ambulance ride to UCSF Medical Center felt like acceleration backward through months of progress. Suddenly, Liam was again surrounded by monitors, IV drips, and medical personnel who spoke in clinical terminology about treatment options and survival probabilities. The pneumonia had triggered systemic complications that threatened multiple organ systems, and his medical team made clear that recovery was uncertain. "His condition is critical," Dr. Coleman explained to Richard and Catherine in the hospital's family conference room. "We are providing aggressive treatment, but his underlying illness makes it difficult for his body to fight off secondary infections. The next 72 hours will be crucial. The crisis forced everyone to confront the possibility that Maria's nurturing care, while emotionally beneficial, might not have provided the medical protection that institutional oversight could have offered. Had their focus on quality of life compromised quantity of life? Had prioritizing happiness over safety shortened the time they'd hoped to preserve? Maria felt the weight of these unspoken questions while maintaining her vigil at Liam's bedside. Hospital policies restricted her access. She wasn't family, and her role as domestic employee didn't grant her the same visitation rights as medical personnel or relatives. But Catherine had insisted that Maria be allowed to stay, recognizing that Liam's comfort might depend on familiar presence during his crisis. For 3 days, the battle played out in slow motion. Medical interventions targeted the pneumonia while monitoring systems tracked every vital sign for changes that might signal either improvement or further decline. Liam drifted between consciousness and sleep, sometimes recognizing voices around him, other times lost in fevered dreams that spoke of his deepest fears and hopes. During his lucid moments, Liam consistently asked for Maria. Her presence seemed to calm his agitation in ways that medical sedation couldn't achieve, and nurses noted that his vital signs stabilized when she held his hand or hummed softly beside his bed. "He responds to you differently than anyone else," Catherine observed during one of their shared night vigils. "I'm his mother. Richard is his father, but you're somehow his anchor." Shum! Maria understood the distinction. Love took many forms. Parental love carried responsibility and fear. Medical love offered expertise and hope for cure. But her love was simpler and perhaps more powerful. Acceptance of Liam exactly as he was, without need to fix him or save him, offering presence without agenda beyond compatibility and care. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. Liam's temperature dropped to normal ranges, his breathing eased, and blood tests showed his body successfully fighting off the infection. The medical crisis had passed, but everyone understood how close they'd come to loss, and how fragile their remaining time would always be. The recovery period required several more days in the hospital, during which the medical team evaluated the pneumonia's impact on Liam's overall condition. The infection had been serious, but hadn't caused permanent damage to his already compromised systems. If anything, his body's ability to recover suggested that the emotional strength he'd developed over recent months might have contributed to his physical resilience. "Sometimes patients surprise us," Dr. Coleman admitted when Liam was finally cleared to return home. His recovery was faster and more complete than we expected given his underlying condition. The near loss had clarified priorities for everyone involved. Richard realized that protecting Liam from all risk was impossible. His son's illness made every day potentially dangerous, regardless of medical precautions. The choice wasn't between safety and risk, but between fear and love as organizing principles for whatever time remained. Catherine reached similar conclusions through her own process of wrestling with helplessness and hope. She couldn't control her son's medical future, but she could influence the quality of days they shared. Maria's approach, focusing on presence rather than outcomes, offered a model for maternal love that transcended traditional protective instincts. When they returned to the mansion in early February, the household felt different again. Smaller, perhaps, but more focused on essential rather than peripheral concerns. Liam's artwork resumed with new urgency. His conversations grew more intimate and philosophical, and his relationships with family members deepened with the understanding that every interaction might be precious in ways they'd never considered before. Maria's role had evolved beyond domestic employee into something resembling family member, not through legal adoption or formal recognition, but through the organic bonds that grow between people who face mortality together with courage and grace. The spring that everyone hoped Liam might live to see remained months away, but the warmth they'd created together made seasons feel less important than the daily choice to love completely while time allowed. Spring arrived in San Francisco with unusual abundance, as if the city were celebrating survival after winter's unprecedented storms. Cherry trees bloomed along the mansion's driveway. The neglected garden showed signs of spontaneous revival, and fog retreated earlier each morning to reveal views that seemed painted with brighter colors than previous years had offered. Liam lived to see the season change, an outcome that had seemed doubtful during January's medical crisis. More remarkably, he was thriving in ways that defied medical expectations. His artwork had progressed from simple sketches to detailed compositions that captured not just visual accuracy but emotional resonance. His panoramic drawing of San Francisco had evolved into a complex work that revealed the city through the eyes of someone who'd learned to see beauty despite suffering. The drawing became the centerpiece of an unexpected project. Catherine had suggested creating a small exhibition of Liam's artwork, not for public display, but as a celebration of his creativity and a way to document the perspective he'd developed through his unique experience. The mansion's library was transformed into a gallery space where his drawings and paintings could be properly presented and appreciated. Friends and extended family were invited to a private viewing on a warm April afternoon when Pacific Heights sparkled under clear skies, and the Golden Gate Bridge stood out like architectural jewelry against the blue bay. The gathering represented the first time the Whitmore Mansion had hosted social events since Liam's diagnosis, and the change in household atmosphere was evident to everyone who attended. "This place feels alive again," remarked Catherine's sister, who'd flown in from Chicago for the art exhibition. "Last time I visited, the house felt like a mausoleum. Now I don't know how to describe it. Hopeful." The transformation was apparent in physical details as well as emotional atmosphere. Maria had gradually introduced small changes that made sterile spaces feel more human. Fresh flowers from the garden, repositioned furniture that encouraged conversation, and cooking aromas that replaced the institutional sense of medical supplies and cleaning products. But the most significant change was in Liam himself. The boy who greeted guests at his art exhibition was obviously ill. His thinness and periodic fatigue made his condition unmistakable, but he carried himself with dignity and enthusiasm that impressed everyone present. He spoke knowledgeably about his artistic techniques, answered questions about his perspectives on city life, and expressed gratitude for his family's support with maturity that seemed remarkable for someone who'd just turned 11. "He's found peace with his situation," observed Dr. Coleman, who'd been invited to the exhibition as someone who'd witnessed Liam's entire medical journey. "That's not something we can prescribe or teach. It has to develop naturally, usually with the support of people who understand how to balance hope with acceptance." The comment was as close to public acknowledgement as Dr. Coleman could offer regarding Maria's influence on Liam's improvement. Medical ethics prevented her from crediting non-professional interventions, but her presence at the art exhibition represented implicit endorsement of whatever methods had achieved such remarkable results. Maria moved through the gathering with her characteristic quiet grace, ensuring that refreshments were available, answering questions about household logistics, and accepting compliments about Liam's progress with humble deflection of personal credit. To observers who didn't know the family's history, she might have seemed like exceptionally dedicated staff. To those who understood her role, she clearly belonged among the family members, receiving congratulations for Liam's achievements. The exhibition's emotional centerpiece was Liam's latest work, a self-portrait that revealed his understanding of himself as someone shaped but not defined by illness. The painting showed a boy with bright, intelligent eyes, surrounded by symbols that represented his interests, relationships, and dreams. Medical equipment appeared in the background, acknowledged but not prominent. The overall effect was of someone who'd integrated suffering into identity without allowing it to dominate his sense of self. "I wanted to show that being sick doesn't mean you're not still yourself," Liam explained to guests who gathered around the self-portrait. "I'm still interested in art and stories and learning about the world. I just happen to need extra help with some things." And the simple statement captured wisdom that many healthy adults never achieved: the ability to acknowledge limitation without abandoning aspiration, to accept help without surrendering autonomy, to face uncertainty without losing curiosity about life's ongoing possibilities. As spring progressed into summer, Liam's condition remained stable, but showed signs of gradual decline that reminded everyone of the terminal nature of his illness. His energy levels decreased slightly, his breathing required more frequent oxygen support, and his appetite became more selective despite Maria's creative cooking attempts. But rather than reverting to despair, the family had learned to adjust expectations while maintaining quality of life. Liam's daily routines were modified to accommodate his changing needs. Shorter periods of activity balanced with adequate rest, meals planned around foods he could enjoy, and social interactions structured to provide stimulation without exhaustion. The approach Maria had pioneered, focusing on present moments rather than future outcomes, had become the family's operating philosophy. Each day offered opportunities for connection, creativity, and small celebrations that accumulated into meaningful experiences regardless of their limited duration. July brought an unexpected gift when Liam expressed desire to visit the neighborhood where Maria lived. He'd listened to her stories about the Mission District for months and wanted to see the places she'd described. The corner market with the friendly owner, the church where she volunteered, the park where families gathered for weekend picnics. The expedition required careful planning and medical preparation. Portable oxygen equipment, emergency medications, and wheelchair accessibility all needed consideration. But Catherine and Richard had learned to evaluate risks differently. Instead of asking whether something was perfectly safe, they asked whether it was meaningful enough to justify reasonable precautions. On a Saturday morning when fog lifted early and promised comfortable temperatures, the family made their pilgrimage to Maria's world. The contrast between Pacific Heights and the Mission District was striking. Narrow streets replaced wide avenues, small businesses replaced upscale boutiques, and apartment buildings replaced single-family mansions. But Liam observed the differences with fascination rather than judgment, seeing complexity and vibrancy that his wealthy neighborhood lacked. Maria's pride in her community was evident as she guided them through streets where she'd lived, worked, and built relationships over 15 years. She introduced Liam to shopkeepers who remembered her family's struggles and celebrated her steady employment, to children who played in playgrounds where she'd once brought her younger siblings, to neighbors who'd watched her grow from scared immigrant teenager to confident woman. "This is where I learned that dignity comes from how you treat people, not how much money you have," Maria explained to Liam as they sat in Dolores Park, watching families enjoy afternoon sunshine. "Everyone here works hard, takes care of each other, and finds happiness in simple things." The lesson wasn't lost on a boy whose family's wealth had proven unable to purchase the things that mattered most: health, time, and genuine human connection. Liam's artwork from this period reflected his expanding understanding of different ways to measure success and find meaning. As summer faded into autumn, Liam's strength continued declining gradually but perceptibly. His medical team made adjustments to pain management and comfort care, acknowledging that curative treatment had exhausted its possibilities. The transition to palliative care was gentle and collaborative, focusing on maintaining quality of life rather than extending quantity at all costs. But instead of defeat, the household atmosphere reflected quiet celebration of time shared and love expressed. Liam completed his panoramic San Francisco drawing, finished several smaller projects, and began dictating stories he wanted preserved for family members to remember. His creativity remained active even as his physical capabilities diminished. The autumn also brought recognition that Maria's role in the family had evolved beyond any traditional employment relationship. Richard and Catherine began discussing legal arrangements that would acknowledge her contributions and secure her future, not as charity, but as recognition of family bonds that transcended conventional definitions. "She saved our son," Catherine reflected during one of her conversations with Richard about household arrangements. "Not medically. We know his illness was always terminal, but she saved his spirit, his dignity, and his capacity for happiness during the time he had. She saved our family's ability to love him fully, instead of just grieving him prematurely." Richard agreed, understanding that Maria's gift hadn't been extending Liam's life but enriching it immeasurably. The months they'd gained weren't measured in additional time but in deeper connection, greater peace, and the knowledge that love could triumph over fear even in the face of inevitable loss. As the year's final season began, everyone understood that their time together was approaching its natural conclusion. But rather than tragedy, the approaching end felt like completion. A story told well, love expressed fully, and dignity maintained despite circumstances that might have broken spirits less carefully tended. Maria had taught them all that healing wasn't always about curing, that strength could be found in acceptance, and that the greatest victories sometimes looked like quiet grace in the face of insurmountable odds. Winter's return to San Francisco brought an unusual gentleness, as if the city itself recognized the profound changes occurring within the Whitmore mansion. The fog rolled in softer, the rains fell lighter, and even the fierce winds that typically announced the season seemed to whisper rather than roar against the windows of the house where a family had learned to love more deeply while preparing to say goodbye. Liam's 12th birthday in November was celebrated with quiet joy and the presence of everyone who'd become important in his transformed world. The gathering was small. Immediate family, Dr. Coleman, a few neighbors from Maria's community who'd grown to know and love the boy through her stories, and the artwork that surrounded them like testimonies to a life lived with purpose despite its brevity. His birthday wish, whispered over candles on a cake Maria had baked using recipes from her grandmother, was not for more time or miraculous healing. Instead, Liam wished for the people he loved to remember happiness rather than sadness when they thought of him. The wish revealed wisdom that seemed impossible for someone so young, yet had developed naturally through months of facing mortality with love and support, rather than fear and isolation. The weeks following his birthday brought the gradual changes everyone had learned to recognize. Liam slept more frequently, ate smaller amounts despite Maria's patient encouragement, and began conversations about subjects he wanted his family to understand after he was gone. But rather than morbid preoccupation with death, his words reflected concern for those who would miss him and hopes for their future happiness. "I want Papa to remember that it's okay to be happy again," Liam told Maria during one of their quiet afternoon conversations. "I want Mama to know that she was a good mother even when she was away, and I want you to know that you saved my whole family by teaching us how to love better." Such statements came naturally now, without the forced cheer or desperate denial that had characterized earlier stages of his illness. Maria had taught him that acknowledging death didn't require abandoning life, and that speaking honestly about final wishes could be an act of love rather than surrender. December brought an unexpected visitor who would provide perspective on the transformation everyone had witnessed but perhaps not fully understood. Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in pediatric palliative care from Stanford Medical Center, arrived for consultation about Liam's comfort care needs. She'd been recommended by Dr. Coleman, who felt that specialized expertise in end-of-life care might benefit the family during this difficult transition. But Dr. Chen's evaluation revealed something remarkable that challenged conventional assumptions about terminal illness care. After reviewing Liam's medical history, speaking with family members, observing household dynamics, and spending time with Liam himself, she reached conclusions that surprised everyone involved. In 20 years of pediatric palliative care, Dr. Chen told Richard and Catherine during their consultation, "I've rarely seen a terminal patient maintain such emotional stability and life satisfaction during decline. Typically, children facing death experience significant anxiety, depression, and social withdrawal. Liam shows none of these typical patterns." Her professional analysis of Maria's influence was carefully worded, but unmistakably positive. "The care environment you've created addresses psychological and spiritual needs that medical intervention alone cannot meet. Your son has achieved what we call death acceptance with life affirmation, a psychological state that's difficult to accomplish and represents the best possible outcome for terminal patients." The validation from pediatric palliative care expertise provided external confirmation of what the family had experienced intuitively. Maria's approach, treating Liam as a whole person rather than just a patient, focusing on present joy rather than future fears, creating space for honest conversations about death while maintaining commitment to life, had achieved results that medical training could recognize but not replicate. As December progressed toward the holidays, Liam's physical decline accelerated gently but unmistakably. He spent most days in bed, requiring oxygen support for comfortable breathing, and eating became difficult despite Maria's continued efforts to prepare foods that might appeal to him. But his spirit remained engaged, his relationships continued deepening, and his artistic work evolved into final projects that seemed to carry special significance. His last major drawing was a portrait of Maria, capturing not just her physical appearance, but somehow portraying the warmth, strength, and quiet dignity that had transformed their household. The drawing showed her hands, marked by years of labor but gentle in their care, holding wildflowers from the garden that had bloomed under her attention. Her expression combined maternal tenderness with the serene acceptance that had guided her approach to Liam's care from the beginning. "This is for you to keep forever," Liam told Maria when he presented the finished portrait. "So you remember that you're not just someone who cleans houses. You're someone who heals families." The gift represented more than artwork. It was recognition, gratitude, and love expressed through the medium Liam had mastered during his final year. Maria received it with tears that mixed sorrow for approaching loss, with joy for love understood and acknowledged. Christmas Eve brought the family together for what everyone understood might be their final celebration. Rather than elaborate gifts or forced festivity, the evening centered around simple presents and shared memories. Liam participated as much as his energy allowed, listening to stories about previous holidays, watching familiar movies, and enjoying small tastes of treats Maria had prepared, with hope rather than expectation. The holiday passed peacefully, marked more by gratitude than grief. Liam's presence, though increasingly fragile, remained the center around which family love orbited. His parents had learned to find comfort in his comfort, peace in his acceptance, and meaning in the time they'd been given rather than anguish over time they would lose. The final weeks of Liam's life unfolded with the gentle rhythm that Maria had established months earlier. Attention to small comforts, conversations about important subjects, and the quiet dignity of love expressed through presence rather than words. Medical care focused entirely on comfort rather than intervention, allowing natural processes to proceed without unnecessary interference. Dr. Coleman continued her visits, but her role had evolved from treating illness to supporting a family through transition. Her presence provided professional reassurance that Liam's comfort was being maintained, while Maria's presence provided the human warmth that made medical care secondary to emotional care. On a January morning when fog lifted early to reveal clear views of the Golden Gate Bridge, Liam died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family members who'd learned to say goodbye gradually over many months rather than suddenly in crisis. Maria was there, holding his hand as she'd done during so many afternoon conversations, her quiet strength providing comfort to parents who faced loss they'd dreaded but learned to accept with grace. The funeral reflected the transformation Liam's life had brought to everyone who knew him. Instead of overwhelming grief, the service celebrated a boy who'd lived fully despite illness, loved deeply despite limited time, and taught adults around him about dignity, acceptance, and the power of human connection to transform suffering into meaning. Maria spoke briefly during the service, her words simple but profound. "Liam taught me that healing isn't always about curing the body. Sometimes it's about freeing the spirit to love completely while time allows. He healed all of us by showing us how to be brave enough to be happy, even when we're scared." Her eulogy captured the essential truth that medical expertise had missed, but intuitive wisdom had understood. Sometimes, the greatest gift we can offer someone facing death is permission to live fully until the end, surrounded by love that asks nothing except the privilege of presence. The months following Liam's death brought a different kind of transformation. As the family learned to carry forward the lessons he'd taught them about love, acceptance, and finding meaning in difficulty. The mansion felt empty without his presence, but not hollow. His influence had warmed spaces that remained changed by his final year of grace and dignity. Maria's role in the family's life continued, though necessarily changed by the absence of the child who'd brought them together. Richard and Catherine established a foundation in Liam's name that would support families facing pediatric terminal illness, with particular emphasis on holistic care approaches that addressed emotional and spiritual needs beyond medical treatment. Maria became the foundation's first program director, her experience with Liam qualifying her uniquely to understand what families needed during such devastating circumstances. Her work would extend the healing she'd brought to one family to countless others facing similar challenges. But perhaps more importantly, Maria had proven to herself and others that wisdom could exist independently of formal education, that healing could occur through love as well as medicine, and that dignity could be maintained in any circumstances when supported by genuine human connection. The story of Maria and Liam became a quiet legend among pediatric care professionals in San Francisco, passed along as an example of what was possible when families were willing to prioritize love over fear, presence over protocol, and meaning over medical intervention alone. Dr. Chen would later write about the case in pediatric care journals, describing without identifying details the remarkable psychological outcomes achieved through what she termed integrated care approaches that recognize the full humanity of terminal patients. Her academic language couldn't capture the warmth and intuitive brilliance of Maria's methods, but it helped establish professional recognition for care approaches that valued emotional healing alongside physical comfort. Years later, when Maria was asked to speak at medical conferences about her experience caring for Liam, she always returned to the same simple truth. I didn't cure his illness, but I helped him remember that he was more than his illness. Sometimes that's the most healing we can offer, helping people remember their beloved just as they are. The Whitmore mansion eventually was sold, too large and too filled with memories for Richard and Catherine to maintain. But the garden that had bloomed again under Maria's care continued flourishing under new owners who never learned its history. Flowers that had brought Liam joy during his final outdoor adventure grew wild and abundant, creating beauty that outlasted the sorrow from which it had emerged. And you, wherever you are right now, perhaps finishing your own long day of caring for others, cleaning spaces where you might feel invisible, or loving people who may not always recognize your value, you carry the same capability Maria discovered in herself, not the power to cure every illness or solve every problem, but the tremendous strength that exists in showing up with love, staying present during difficulty, and believing that every person deserves dignity regardless of their circumstances. Have you ever known someone like Maria? Have you ever been someone like Maria, offering quiet healing through simple presence and unconditional care? Share your story in the comments below, because these experiences need to be witnessed and honored. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone special in your own life, or if it helped you see your own caregiving work in a new light, please leave a like and subscribe so we can continue sharing stories that celebrate the invisible heroes among us. For more stories that honor the strength found in quiet service and the healing power of love, click the podcast link. Thank you for sharing this emotional journey with us, and remember, the greatest healing often comes not from those with the most credentials, but from those with the most compassion. We'll see you in our next story, where we'll continue exploring the extraordinary courage that exists in ordinary lives and the profound impact one person's love can have on everyone they touch.